and introduce Bob O. from Denver, Colorado.
Thank you. There's a man that's dying in a bed in a Veterans Hospital in central Wisconsin tonight. He had a stroke about 15 years ago as a direct result of his alcoholism, and because of that, he lost his ability to speak, and it paralyzed most of his body. And the problem with that is that in all those years of inactivity, he's lost his circulation in his extremities. They have to surgically remove pieces of him, like his feet. And his new extremities then lose their circulation, and they have to take off another piece. About 2 weeks ago, they asked his brother what to do about that. They said, the choices are to just keep taking pieces off of him or to let him die. And his brother decided, his brother's his guardian, decided to let him die. In the 15 years that he's been there, he's never been visited by one of his 9 ex-wives. He's only had occasional visits from both his brother and the son and daughter that he abandoned when they were children. He's dying like an alcoholic. He screams at the people around him in his fear and his frustration. And he's dying that way. He's dying in terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair. His name's Bob Olson. He's my dad. And he's dying like generations of my family have died. My name's Bob Olson. I'm an alcoholic. I want to get rid of this. I pulled a muscle coming up this hill. It's by the grace of God and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous that I've not found a need or an excuse to die like that today, nor have I found a need or an excuse to die like that since May 28th of 1973, and I'm truly grateful for that. If any of you think that alcoholism is cute or funny, spend an hour in my dad's shoes. When you can't talk, and you know you're dying, and you can't stop, and you have no control, and you have no faith, and you have nothing to look forward to but dying, and you don't know what that is. This is not a funny disease. When I was a kid, I was bred to be an alcoholic. I was expected to be an alcoholic. I was brought up by alcoholics, and I turned out to be an alcoholic. I lived in insanity. There were a lot of people just thought I was crazy because I did things that were so paradoxical. I was bright. They started testing my IQ when I was about 10. Everyone had great expectations for me. I did some real positive things when I was in high school. When I was a junior in high school, in fact, I was vice president of the class. I was head of the citizenship club. I started junior achievement in my hometown. I was president of the church youth group. I ran a gambling operation at a racetrack. And I was arrested for assault and sentenced to 2 years in the Green Bay State Reformatory, which I didn't have to serve. I'm the kind of person that when I take a drink, my life changes. My personality changes. Everything changes. I'm a lot like what my dad was. I never really knew my dad very well. The occasions that I did see him, he was generally trying to hit me for something. But people used to tell me, he's one of the nicest guys in the world. He really is. But when he's drinking, watch out. Because his personality changes and he is dangerous. And that's the way he was. He was a two-fisted, hard-fighting, hard-drinking drunk. And what I didn't know was that he was terrified, and the reason why he hit everybody was because he was afraid. My life was, I don't think I started drinking like an alcoholic. I really don't. I think I sort of earned my way in or something. Because I drank, I didn't get in a whole lot of trouble. I threw up a lot. I went through the Navy without any real problems. I went to the University of Wisconsin. I was in the top 3% scholastically at the University of Wisconsin, and they were trying to get me into medical school. But I felt like I was crazy. This paradox in my life where I could not go into a classroom and say here because I was too terrified, and at the same time I was the social chairman for the largest fraternity on the campus. I just knew I was crazy. And I knew that I felt better when I drank, but it really hadn't connected, and I thought, well, maybe I'm just a little screwed up because I live around all these insane people, and I'll go get a job. So I quit the university, and I went and I got, looked in the paper and saw a job that was for a loan company. And I thought, well, that's a good start. I'll go do that. And I interviewed with a loan company, and they hired me, and they sent me up to central Wisconsin. And what I didn't know was that they hired me as a bill collector. So when I went out to collect bills, I thought I would be diplomatic, and I would go out and say, well, gee, this payment's past due, and we'd like you to make a payment. And the response I generally got was, take a hike, or you want to get hurt, hang around, or something even a little more emphatic. And so I was sort of driven by this desire to succeed, because no one in my family had ever been very successful. And the only thing we'd really ever been successful at was dying drunk. And so I really wanted to do it right. I went from about 160 pounds up to 240 pounds, and I went out to collect some money. That wasn't really in keeping with my view of myself, and so I used to stop at this bar next door and have shooters, have a shot and beer, just sort of stay together. And I'd have 3 or 4 before I went home at night, just so I could wind down a little bit, because it's real tough if you're out there face-to-face with people every day trying to get money out of them, and especially if you were collecting from them the way I was. I got to the point where I would kick down people's doors. I'd get them alone. My favorite thing was to get them locked in a room. What I'd usually do is just slam them up against a wall until they figured out where they'd come up with money. I learned more about intimidation than I ever want to know. I used to talk to people like nothing was going on while I was slamming them up against the wall and try and get them to collapse. There was one guy I remember that got the hives every time he saw me. There were women who would break into tears on the street if they saw me. I came to the attention of some people in Chicago who make a business out of that sort of thing. My best friend in high school, a fellow who had been convicted of the same assault that I had been involved in, and who had become a big success like me, he was a pimp. He came to me one day and said, we'd like you to go to work at the racetrack. And I said, I don't know anything about running a racetrack. And he said, no, they just want you to walk around with the guy that runs the racetrack. And I said, why would they do that? And he said, don't you know? No. And he said, you're crazy. They give you a gun, tell you to kill somebody, and you'd probably do it. And that's what they want. At the same time, I was president of the JCs. I was president of the Optimist Club. I was voted one of the outstanding young men of the community, and I was on the governor's committee for mental health. I do hurtful, tragic, bizarre things when I drink. And always to the people that I love, always to the people that are closest to me. I became very successful in the loan business. I had the lowest delinquency rate in the whole corporation. They couldn't believe how I could do it. My vice president in the Optimist Club was the district attorney. And he was also my next door neighbor, and he'd come over and he'd go, "Bob, this guy says you ran him off the road, dragged him out of his car, and beat the shit out of him. That's not an effective collection procedure." I said, "Yes, it is." And he'd go, "You really can't do that anymore." And I'd go, "Yeah, I know, but this guy was just a bad apple." And I was protected through that. I left that business and I became a salesman for a paper company up there. And in the course of about 2 years, I'd gone from a sales trainee to a salesman to an assistant sales manager to a sales manager to a plant manager in Minneapolis. I at that point I was drinking about probably a fifth a day, and I had gotten to the point where I just could not go without it. I had found some doctors who would prescribe me some Librium so I wouldn't have to really get wasted on alcohol right away in the morning. I know if I took a couple of those things that I wouldn't have to drink right away, and I could wait till like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Because I had gotten to the point where I started shaking so bad when I got up in the morning that if I couldn't find something to get rid of it, I had to take a drink. And it would prevent me from going into DTs. So I'd take some chemicals in the morning, and then I would wait until it was socially acceptable or until I had to, and then I would drink. That was usually at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I became very successful at that. I turned a plant around. I raised their sales, got this thing profitable. It was just, they thought it was just wonderful. And I was going to become the youngest vice president in that corporation's history. It was a Fortune 500 company. And I couldn't stop drinking. One weekend, I had gotten up in the morning and I had gone out to look for the paper or something, and I didn't know what was the problem. I had walked out, picked up the paper, and it felt like somebody had reached inside of my chest and started ripping things out, and I thought, I must be having a heart attack. And I went over and just broke out in a sweat, and my knees got weak, and I went over and sat down on the couch and waited for it to go away, and it went away, and I thought, well, that's the end of that. Got up and started doing something else, and it happened to me again, and I thought, I better get to a hospital. I called the police department, and they knew me fairly well there. And I asked them if they'd give me a ride over to the hospital because I was afraid to drive over there, and they told me no. And then I asked my long-suffering wife if I told her, I think I'm having a heart attack and I need to go to the hospital. Will you drive me over there? And she said no. So I drove myself over there and walked into the emergency room, and they said, "What's the problem?" And I said, "I'm having a heart attack." And they said, "All right." And I got in one of these little gowns, and I was on this gurney or whatever, and I was laying there, and I waited about 20 minutes, and nobody showed up. And so I got up and walked around looking for a doctor, and I found a guy with a stethoscope, and I said, "Could you help me?" And he said, "Sure, what's the problem?" And I said, "I'm not sure." There are times, there's a line in the book that I just love, occasionally he tells the truth. I could be having a heart attack, or I'm having a nervous breakdown, or I'm suffering from alcohol withdrawal. And he said, if you're having a nervous breakdown or you're suffering from alcohol withdrawal, we're going to have to put you in the psychiatric ward. I said, well, then I'm having a heart attack. He checked me out. He asked about my doctor, and I said, well, he's this doctor over in Crystal, and he called him up, and he came back about 20 minutes later, and he had a jar of 500 Librium capsules. And he said, take 5 of these instead of 3. And I don't blame him for that. You know, it just got me there quicker. It doesn't make any difference to me. I'll tell you how I dealt with that. I had gone to this doctor, and he said, for a physical. And I said, I don't feel good. And he said, well, you got a liver like a football. I don't know what you're doing, but if you keep doing it, you're going to die of a heart attack or a stroke, 80% in the next 4 years. I went, okay. And I thought, well, he's really full of shit. And so I went across town to another doctor and went through the whole test again. And when he got done with the test, I went in to talk with him, and he said, well, he said, you have an enlarged liver. And I don't know what you're doing, but if you continue to do it, your chances of a heart attack or a stroke in the next 4 years are 80%. And I knew they were talking to each other. And that's the way I lived my life. You know, I remember when I used to come down here, I loved to talk about drunk stories. And I'll tell you what, I don't anymore. I'll tell you this stuff just so you know I'm a drunk. You know, I'm a fallen down, burned out, blown away drunk. And I want to share that with you because what I really came down here to talk with you about is recovery. That's really I got me drunk. And it seems a little stupid for me to stand up here and talk with you about what I did for myself. My best efforts got me here just like yours did. But let me tell you what God did for me, because that's the most important thing. In about March of 1973, I had gone to Alcoholics Anonymous off and on since 1968. I had gone drunk or whacked out on pills, and I'd go in there and I'd let somebody stroke me, and they would tell me I was going to be fine, and I would get up and go get a drink. And that's nothing against them. I just wasn't ready to do it. In about March of 1973, I was in a little town in Wisconsin, Fond du Lac, and I started going back to AA, but I could not stop drinking. And I had managed somehow in that period to stay sober about 2 days. And during those couple days, someone had come up and offered to be my sponsor. And so I would talk to him periodically. And after a couple of months, I called him up and I said, you know, this isn't going to work. I know you guys really have a problem, but I'm sort of a social drinker. I like to drink martinis. I'm a little classier kind of drinker. I don't get into a lot of trouble. You know, all you guys have lost your jobs. I still have a job. You've all lost your wives. I still have a wife. Your kids all hate you. Mine love me. That was a lie. I just am not having the problems in my life that you are. So I really appreciate all the time and effort that you put in on me, but I'm just not an alcoholic. And he said, well, I appreciate your call, and I'm sure we'll see you again. Sometime around May 28th, I think it could have been any number of days, but I know that one's safe. It could have happened before that. I had gone through about a 3 or 4 day blackout. I'd been on a binge. I'd wound up in this house alone. My wife and children had left. And I wound up on the floor of an empty house. And that's where you found me. I thought I was going to die. I was picked up by this same guy that said he would see me again, and one of his pigeons. And they took me to a halfway house just to hang out, and sat me down in front of a priest, the guy that was running it. The fact that he was a priest is sort of incidental. And he asked me some questions. He said, are you an alcoholic? And I said, yeah, and you know, it's the first time in my life I knew it. I've been watching my dad die from it for years, and I didn't even know I was. And he said, do you believe in God? I said, no. And he said, well, it's part of the deal. And I said, I don't know how to do that. And he said, well, just go find one you can believe in. And I went home, and for the next 2 weeks, other than going to meetings, I just sort of tried to live. I tried to survive. I saw all sorts of stuff. I was hallucinating in there. I saw things coming out from underneath the refrigerator that would make these horror movies look like Mary Poppins. I was absolutely certain I was going to die. There was no treatment center there. My option was to go home and shake it out. And that's what I did. And I went through hallucinations, and I went through sweats, and I went through a fear of death, and I went through everything. I think that's a hell of an exercise if you want to get sober, by the way. If you've been through 2 or 3 treatment centers, stay home the next time. It'll make a hell of an impression on you, if you survive it. The big book says we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic. It's the first step in recovery. The delusion that we're like other people or presently maybe has to be smashed. I'm not like other people. When I drink, I lose control. I do weird, tragic, bizarre things. I hurt everybody. You give me alcohol, I'm like a tornado going through other people's lives. That's the way alcohol works with me. It's the way it's always worked with my family. It's inevitable. That's the way it works for me, and it's never going to change. I go through the steps a lot because I know that's how to get sober. I mean, I found that out after I'd been sober for about a year, and I was presented really with this program the way it is. I was given God's grace for a year, and then I was presented with this program. Someone sat down and described the steps to me, and I did them. And one of the things that I have to do when I go through today, and I'm going to give you some of my perspective from being 15 years sober, and that is that when I go back and do a first step today, I have to ask myself some questions. And they have to do with my drinking. You know that if when you want to, you find that you can't quit entirely. Was that going on in my life? Yeah. When I drank, and I would go, I'm never going to do this again, so help me, I would drink again. I could never stop. Or if once you start, do you have little control over the amount you take? Yeah. How many times did I go out to drink 2 drinks and not stop? I never could control how many drinks I drank. When you look in the big book and it talks about the different kind of drinkers, it talks about a social drinker. And then it talks about a certain kind of hard drinker. And I need to ask myself, am I a certain kind of hard drinker? That hard drinker can wind up in an institution, can get arrested for drunk driving, can get divorced by his wife, can get hated by his children. He can go through all of those things in his life, but if there's a sufficient reason, he can stop. A doctor's advice, legal problems, whatever. If there's sufficient reason, he can stop. Could I stop? No. My wife used to come to me and say, we need to buy some clothes for Tommy, and it's only 2 bottles of booze. I can't do it. We're running out of food. I need to go to the grocery store. It's only going to be a couple of bottles of booze. Can't do it. If you just stop drinking, everything would be all right. I'll leave you if you don't stop drinking. Tommy's afraid of you. He doesn't know what you're going to do when you're drunk. Can't help it. I'm not some kind of monster. Just everything pales in comparison to my need to drink. And I have to look at that. Was I ever really a social drinker? I don't think so. I always had some intent there, and boy, when it caught a hold of me, it was just like bar the door. And I need to look at that today. Is there anything in my experience, anything at all, that would lead me to believe that I can successfully drink today? Because that's a real danger to someone who just hasn't had a drink for a long time. No, there is nothing in my experience that shows me that I could somehow survive taking a couple of drinks with impunity. In the doctor's opinion, there's this thing about a person watching other people drinking with impunity. It talks about him being, boy, my mind is really messed up. I don't remember. Well, I have a mind like a piece of Swiss cheese. I really do. There's holes in it. And every once in a while, something just goes in there and you never find it again. I was sober about 90 days in this little group, and my sponsor was sticking to me like glue and taking me on 12-step calls, and I was sick and shaken and couldn't make any sense, and they wouldn't call on me in meetings, and it was just really, I'd sit on my hands and I'd sweat so bad that my whole shirt had turned colors, and he'd take me on these 12-step calls, and I'd go, I don't know anything about this, Leo. I mean, what do you even take me along for? And he'd go, well, you know, I'm pretty old and my nose doesn't work, and you got to smell and see if they got booze on their breath. Right, you got it. Yeah. And I'd go, oh, that's how well my mind was working. I was sober about 90 days, and when you chaired a meeting in this town, you chaired it for 90 days. And the old line Tuesday meeting was coming up, and they needed a new chairman, and everyone in that group had chaired that meeting except me, and they wouldn't let you chair a meeting unless you've been sober 90 days. And so they had an election, and they said, okay, who's going to chair the Tuesday night meeting? And my sponsor jumped up and said, let's let Bob do it. Another guy jumped up and said, wait a minute, we need to talk about this. And another guy jumped up and he said, that's a hell of a good idea, let's talk about this. You know, if you're real paranoid to begin with, that kind of stuff doesn't help your self-esteem. And so Leo said, that's all right, Bob, just go outside, have a cigarette, and you can come back in a couple of minutes. And they had a hell of a discussion. I mean, I was sitting out there for like 10 minutes, waiting for them to decide whether I was good enough to chair an AA meeting. And when they called me back in, this little old sponsor I had prevailed. And he said, you're the new chairman of this meeting, and you're going to have to chair it every Tuesday night for the next 3 months. You know, for the next 3 months, I didn't take a drink because I wouldn't let them sons of bitches see me drunk. And that's the wrong reason, isn't it? I don't give a shit. Next week I'm going to be sober 16 years. It works. Some of us are just slower than others. My second step experience was this. My sponsor came up to me and he said, why are you sober? And this was along in the same time when this meeting thing happened. And I said, I'm sober because I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, bullshit. You've been hanging around Alcoholics Anonymous since 1968 and it never kept you sober before. What are you doing differently? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, are you exercising? And I said, no. Are you going to work regularly? No. You on some kind of special diet? No. Well, what are you doing differently? I don't know. Does it have anything to do with God? Well, the only thing that I'm doing is that I'm praying in the morning and asking God to keep me sober like He asked me to, and I'm praying at night, thanking Him when I go to sleep, and that's it. And he said, do you believe it? I said, no. And he said, would you concede that you're sober today by the grace of a God you don't even believe in? And he was right. That's how I came to believe, because it works, because you don't have to start even knowing. When the book talks about the second step, it says if we're even willing to believe. Upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. Just a willingness to believe. That's why there's so many groups called mustard seed, because it only takes a tiny grain of faith. It says, crushed by a self-imposed crisis, we could neither postpone nor evade. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that God either is or He isn't. He's either everything or He's nothing. What's your decision to be? What's my self-imposed crisis? Well, I know it's my alcoholism, but it's more than that. My self-imposed crisis is that I can't fix myself. I'm dying, I've got a progressive disease, and I can't stop. I can't fix myself. And there's more bad news in there. More bad news is no human power can relieve my alcoholism. If no human power can relieve my alcoholism and I can't relieve my alcoholism, who the hell is going to relieve my alcoholism? You know what the next line is in the book? Here we are squarely confronted with the issue of faith. You know why? Because if there isn't a God, we're SOL. Okay? If there isn't a God, there's no way to stop. The thing that I enjoyed, there was a workshop over here today about power. You know, in the second step, that's where it really starts talking about power. Lack of power is our dilemma. How are we to define such power? Well, that's what this book is about. And it talks about a willingness to believe, and right after that it says, we felt new power flowing in. And from a second step position today, I get driven to that second step position by remembering that when I make heavy going out of my life, that's the place to look, okay? You don't get immune when you've been sober for a while. There's the most interesting thing in here that's called the bedevilments. Well, it talks about we were having trouble with personal relations. We were prey to misery and depression. Couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. You know that happens to you when you're sober sometime? And if that happens to you when you're sober, look in that part of the book because it says something very interesting. It says that there's these kind of people that make heavy going out of life, and then there's these other kind of people that have power, peace, happiness, and a sense of direction, which incidentally is everything I ever wanted out of life. And the difference between those people is that those people with power, peace, happiness, and a sense of direction, the central fact in their life is the consciousness of the presence of God. Isn't that interesting? This meeting that I was at down here 10 years ago, the story that I related there was that after the 1975 International, there was a guy that came down from Canada named Mac Cheater, and he had told about the Golden Slippers group in Winnipeg, and how they had been, the reason they were called the Golden Slippers was because nobody ever stayed sober up there, and then all of a sudden they had gone through this revolutionary change. They had this idea that was totally out of character. Instead of rationalizing about the steps and intellectualizing about the steps and talking ad nauseum about the steps, they were going to do the steps. You know, there were a bunch of us who were sitting around there at that 75 convention going, what a hell of an idea. And there were about 15 of us that got together and went through the steps as a group. And out of all of those people in 1975 that went through those steps as a group, 14 of us are alive and sober, and the other one died sober. And that's the power of this program. This is about getting closer to God. Sometime I was up in North Dakota talking to one of these conventions, and this guy that picked me up at the airport says, this deal is really about fellowship, isn't it? And I said, no, it isn't. And he said, but it's about guys kind of hanging together, isn't it? And I went, no, it's not. That's a result of something. In the beginning of the book, it talks about these people on this ship. It talks about the camaraderie that pervaded the ship from steerage to captain's table, across the whole breadth of the ship. And that they were brought together by having survived this common peril, okay? But that isn't what held them together. What held them together was a common solution. If you see a group today that's dying in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's because they don't have a common solution, okay? And if you see people dying in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's because they either haven't found a common solution or they haven't accepted a common solution. And the solution is that there are 12 spiritual exercises with numbers on them for dummies like me that will help me survive my alcoholism. And that's this program. And the fellowship arises out of it. You know, I will guarantee you, if you hate my guts, and you and I go through the work together, we will be friends. You cannot share that with someone and not come away with a degree of friendship. It's just too intimate. In the third step, the book really starts talking about what alcoholism is. It talks about selfishness, self-centeredness. That we think is the root of our problems. Now all of a sudden I found out it's not this deal where I just couldn't lay a bottle down. Now all of a sudden the root of my alcoholism is all these manifestations of self which had defeated me. And what my sponsor told me was that if I did something about my selfishness, that I wouldn't have to drink anymore. And what was really more important was that I didn't have to want to drink anymore. That's what I want. I don't want to have to think about it. And I don't. And we read all about this selfishness and self-centeredness, and then we came up on the third step prayer, and he read the prayer to me. God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy love, thy power, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Here's the deal. God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. God, I'm going to let you have all of me. You can do anything with me you want. Anything. Kill me. Let me live. Let me have a good relationship with my family. Let them hate me. Have me live in Denver. Have me live in Ethiopia. You can do anything you want. Make me healthy. Give me a terrible disease. Do anything. There's the deal. Relieve me of the bondage of self that I may better do thy will. You know, my real problem with alcoholism is that I can't see you. I'm not concerned about you. All I can see is myself. I serve no purpose except my own. And if you're in my way, you're in trouble. I am in bondage to that. I am chained to myself. Relieve me of that. Let me look at you. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help with thy love, thy power, and thy way of life. You know, bearing witness means be an example. Let me be an example. Let people look at me and see that there is recovery and that there's more than that. You know, I'm working with a guy right now that's 6'6" of straight insanity. I mean, this guy, if I'd seen him in a bar, I would have left. And I asked him, you know, he's in the middle of writing inventory right now. And I said, Mike, why'd you ask me? And he said, because I really like the way you live. There's just something about you, you know. Your whole life isn't tied right in A's like some people are. You really work at the program. You work with other people. You're available. You live in a nice house and you have a beautiful wife. And you drive a new Corvette. He said, you're just out there and involved in life. There's a line in this book that says, and go on about the business of living. Okay? This program has given me the opportunity to go on about the business of living. I get out there and participate as vigorously in my life as I can. I mean, I think I'm only going to get one shot at this. And I have gotten a clear mind from working the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I want to find out what I can do with it. I'm not going to go hide in a corner. I will not have recovered. I want to get right out in the middle of them. So if you're hiding under your chair because you're a drunk, get the hell out from underneath there and enjoy some of God's power. I really have to tell you that when I was down here in 78, that there were a lot of people that really wanted the solution. And I sat in these workshops with you today, and I'm trying to figure out what the hell I have to talk to you about. Because there are so many of you who work this program vigorously, and it shows. This is a hell of a group. You got lots of power, and it's just fun to be here. I did what you do. I got on my knees with my sponsor and said the third step prayer, and I meant it. And I was terrified, because I was afraid to give God that kind of power. That's pretty funny. It's like he didn't have it. I mean, he's going to do what he wants to do anyway. It was me figuring that out. You know what that is? That's an exercise in who's God and who's the drunk. That's what that is. Okay, I'm here and you're there and it's all right with me. My sponsor, after we got up, I thought, gee, this is great. Now we'll have a little breather, and he explained to me that in nowhere in the big book says, now take 2 months off because you had a hard time with this decision. You ever see people coming to Alcoholics Anonymous today and they go, just let me get my feet on the ground. That's all right. Take 2 or 3 months and you'll just be fine. You go to meetings, read the big book, talk to somebody, you know, call your sponsor, do something. You know what the strongest statement in the big book is, in my estimation? Listen to this. And this is uncharacteristic of a drunk. With all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. What the hell does that mean? Does that mean wait 3 months and get your head on straight? You wait 3 months, you're going to have your head up your ass. My sponsor says, well, this is great. You made this decision. But unfortunately, it will have little permanent effect unless you at once go on about cleaning house. And he read it to me out of the book. So I started writing inventory, and it really would have been swell if he would have said, here's a Hazleton guide, fill it in. Or here's the Brentwood guide, just go down the columns. Or why don't you write me the story of your life? Gosh, that would have been swell. Unfortunately, he said, here's the way you do it. You write down who you're angry at. It's a grudge list. People, institutions, and principles. And that goes in the first column. And the second column is why you're mad at them. And don't spend a lot of time in that column because it doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with anything. And in the third column, you're going to see where it affected your self-esteem, your security, your ambitions, your personal and sex relations, your pocketbook, and you're going to see where you were afraid. And so that's what I did. And I wrote all this stuff down, and it took me like a month. And then I thought I was done. And he said, no. And he said, now you have to go back in each one of those resentments, and you have to see where you were selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened. And, oh, my God. And so I go back down, and I was traveling, I was selling stuff, and I would go into motels at night and sit down, and I would write, and it was just like, it really was tough for me to write that stuff. And then I'd check with him, and he'd go, you're doing fine, just keep doing it. And at one point I ran out. And I went in and I said, I'm done with my inventory. And he said, no, sir. Now you got a fear inventory. And I said, I'm going to need some help with that. And so we went over and sat down across his kitchen table, and he took out a pad and a pencil and handed it to me. He said, what are you afraid of? I said, nothing. And he said, well, how about snakes? And I said, what kind of snakes? And he said, well, how about rattlesnakes? And I said, well, I wouldn't want to be in a closet with one. And he said, well, write down rattlesnakes. So I wrote it down, and he said, how about spiders? And I said, you mean like black widow spiders? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, I'll give you that. And I wrote down black widow spiders. And he said, how about failure? And it was like, it's like getting punched in the stomach. Because everybody in my family had always been a failure. And I said, yeah, that's something I've always been afraid of. So he said, write down failure, and I wrote it down. He said, how about inadequacy? Well, I sure never thought I was as good as anybody else. Well, write down inadequacy. How about women? I've always been afraid of women. Well, not anymore, but... So write down women. How about little children? Well, I'm afraid to hold infants because I think I'm going to drop them. And he said, write down infants. How about homosexuality? Well, we don't talk about that. Well, I don't understand it, and I've always been a little afraid of it. And he said, well, write down homosexuality. Is there anything you're not afraid of? I don't think so. The book says when you write all this stuff down, you ask a question about it. It says, wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? Yeah. Left to my own devices in the absence of God, do I have any reason to be afraid of that stuff? Yeah, I really do. But if I turn the question around and I say, if I am standing with God, do I have to be afraid of that? No, sir. You know why I'm not afraid to talk in front of this group or any other group? Because before I get up here, I sit down and I imagine God as my Father with his hand on my shoulder. Nothing can touch me. So I don't have to be afraid. My prayer before I get up here, God, let me be an instrument of thy will, even if it makes me look like a fool. That's the way it works. Then he asked me to write a sex inventory after I got done with my fear inventory. It was about where I had been selfish and self-seeking in relationships, and it talked about my behavior. Some interesting questions in there. Where had I unjustifiably aroused jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Look at that. You know what? Those are tools. I control people with jealousy, suspicion, and bitterness. It was my stock in trade. I did not know how to have a relationship, and so the only way that I could keep in that relationship was by keeping my partner off balance. And the tools that I used were jealousy, suspicion, and bitterness. Honey, you should have seen this lady, and she just thought I was great. Yeah, I know I got home late, but I was just riding around. Yeah, well, there was a little lipstick there, but that was, something. I had an exuberant secretary or something. You're a bitch, and you've always been one, and get your act straightened out. That's the only way I knew how to have a relationship. So when it asks those questions about jealousy, suspicion, and bitterness, see if it has anything to do with the way you have a relationship. I never found a relationship that I wasn't selfish and self-seeking in. I was so self-centered that I just thought their only purpose was to keep me happy. I've been married about 3 years now, and I'm trying to have a relationship with a lady that's a sharing relationship. Another drunk lady, a recovering drunk. She's 10 years sober. And I learned how to communicate. God, is that wonderful. I mean, it's tough, but it's wonderful. Yes, I know there's a problem. Okay, let's talk about it. Okay. I don't want to change my mind, but let's try and find a solution somewhere in the middle. Okay? That's tough for me. I don't know how to do that. Every drunk I've ever met, their solution for a relationship is, fuck it, I'm leaving. You want to find out if you're a real man? Stand in the middle. And we'll find out what kind of stuff you got. Stand right in the middle and figure it out. And if you can't figure it out, get somebody to help you figure it out. I have a 1-year-old son. I'm 51 years old. He just adores me. He gets so excited when I come home. It's just wonderful. I couldn't have had that. I have 2 other sons, 21 and 26. On the 23rd of next month, my 2 oldest sons and I are going 185 miles northwest of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and we're going to stay for a week, and we're going to go fishing, and we're going to mail bond. We're going to sit out there and belch and talk about women and do all that stuff. And we're going to spend a whole week together where there's no phones and nothing else, and we're just going to go fishing. And I couldn't have done that. I wrote this whole inventory. My first inventory, I grouped Fifth Step, part of it in this group that we had formed after the 75 International, and I have to tell you that the feedback on that was pretty spectacular. And the reason why was because if one person would have told me where my defects of character was, I probably wouldn't have believed him. When you've got 7 or 8 people that are sounding like the Anvil chorus, you have much more of an inclination to believe that somehow they may have a fragment of truth in what they're saying. The tough stuff, the take it to the grave stuff. I fifth stepped with my sponsor. My sponsor, incidentally, is the guy who talked here last year, Don Pritz. And I was sitting there with Don, and Don was the first guy that I'd ever really let in. I've been a loner all my life. It's hard for me just to get around people. I just don't do that very well, and I'm trying to learn how to do that. And I'd sort of let him in, and you know how when you get something you don't want to lose it? And I was afraid that if I fifth-stepped with him, I'd lose it, because I've been down some pretty muddy roads. And I fifth-stepped it with him anyway. And when I got done with my fifth step, he got up and threw his arms around me, and he said, I love you. And I'm so happy that you've done this. And what I found out was, as bad as I was, that he would accept me. That there was someone else in the world that knew everything about me, and it was all right. And my life changed right then. Because for the first time in my life, I believed that what you see is what you get, and it was all right. And it's okay if you don't like everything about me. It's all right if you don't like anything about me. I'm just trying to get better on a daily basis, and I'm just another drunk. And I'm trying to make my life make sense, and the only way I know how to do it is by getting closer to God, by practicing these principles. I did what the book says. I went home. Actually, it says taking the book down from the shelf, so I put it up on the shelf and took it down. And I went and reviewed the first 5 proposals to see whether I'd made mortar without sand. And then I did step 6 and 7. I became willing to have God remove all these defects of character. And then I asked him to remove them. And I did the 7th step prayer. The book says, We made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And the next line in the book says, we did it when we took inventory. If you write an inventory out of the big book, you've probably got most of your amends list already written. That's what it says. So I went and I reviewed my amends list, and I went to my sponsor, and I added a few people that weren't in my inventory. And then I went to my sponsor, and I said, what do I do with this? And he said, the first thing you need to do is you need to find out what the harm is. Because if I know you, you're just going to run out there and try and make wholesale amends to everybody, and you won't have the slightest idea why you're there. So he said, in each one of those, you need to sit down and see what the harm is. So I went through my whole amends list, and I wrote down the specific harm that I had created in each one of those people's lives. And when I went to make amends, I knew why I was going. So I got all that done, and then I went to him and I said, well, here's the people that I think I should make amends to, and here's the people that I think I'll harm if I make amends to them. And then there's my dad over there, who I had hated all my life. And I didn't have to make amends to him because he was in this hospital, and he wasn't capable of understanding, and because his mind was all screwed up. And my sponsor said, well, see, amends are about cleaning off your side of the street. It doesn't have anything to do with it, whether he understands or not. So what you do is you get in your car and you drive to Wisconsin, and you go to that veterans hospital, and you make amends to him. And that's it. You know, I would have punched him out. I don't like those kind of answers. So I got in my car and went to Wisconsin, and I went into this hospital, and my dad was sitting in a wheelchair, and I went up to him and said, hi, and he looked up at me, and I said, I'm your son, Bob. I hadn't seen him in 10 years. I really didn't know him very well. And I wheeled him off into this corner, and I said, I need to make amends to you. I've held you at arm's length my whole life because I did not understand your alcoholism. And I see today that all the things that you did were because you had to do them. And you didn't really have any choice in doing that. And I'm trying to understand that. And I didn't even begin to understand that until I became an alcoholic. And I'm practicing this program that will allow me to recover from that. And part of the program is to come to you to make amends. You know, when I told my dad that I was an alcoholic, he became very sad. And so I know that something inside of him understands. And when I told him that I had found a solution, this man whose life was taken from him, who lives with the Four Horsemen today, understood, and there was some joy that he showed in my having found a solution. I owed a lot of money and didn't own anything. And so I went to my uncle, who is a banker, and I said, I had this problem. I owe an awful lot of money, and I don't know how to pay it, and I need some advice. So he said, let me take a look at it. And I showed him my financial condition, and he said, okay, how'd you get that far in? And I said, I'm an alcoholic. I have to drink, and that's what I did. I mean, I had to buy booze, and I did everything I could to get the money, and that's what happened. Now what I really need to know is, how do I get out of it? And he said, well, it's fairly simple. You start paying now, and you pay till it's paid. Swell. So I did that. I started paying like 30% of my income to my creditors. And about 2.5 years later, I had that down to about $2,500. And I had moved to Denver, and I was hanging around York Street, which is the old mother house down there. And I was running around the AA meetings telling everybody what a big damn deal I was. Telling them, boy, you know, look at how much money I owed in the beginning, and I only owed $2,500, and that's going to go pretty quick, and haven't I done just a swell job? Gosh, I mean, you could really look up to me about this. In the process of paying all this money out, I got real tight. I mean, I wouldn't spend anything on anything. And we had not really gone out to movies or dinners or anything like that for a long time, trying to get out of the hole. And thank God that I had some help with that with my wife, and my kids understood. And one day, they had a boat show. And you know, I've always loved boats. And you know, when I was a kid, I used to go to a lot of lakes around Wisconsin, and I'd go sit on the shore of that lake and I'd watch those guys go back and forth in those boats, and I'd go, by God, one day I'm going to have one of those. I mean, I always wanted a boat. And if they had a boat show or something, I wanted to go. And I'd just go down there. It was like looking in a catalog, you know. It just was something you could dream about. And I went to this boat show, and the Bassmasters were down there having a raffle. And before I even knew it, I had given them $10 for 3 tickets. And I thought, what a dumb shit thing to do. Here I gave them $10, and the chances of winning that thing are nil. And I went home, and I was mad. And the next day they called me and told me I won it. And I got excited about it. I said, I won that damn boat. And it was this Rebel bass boat, right, in the trailer and all the rest of that. And my kids were going, wow, is that ever great? And they said, where is it? And I said, well, it's down at Garp Brothers. And so we went down to the sporting goods store, and there was this boat, and it was all decked out and everything. And my kids are going, God, is this our boat, Dad? Is this ever wonderful? And they're crawling around on the boat. And I said, no. And this Texan came up to me, and he said, do you want to sell the boat? And I said, how much would you give me for it? He said, $2,500. And I said, I went over to the Rebel bass boat dealer, and I said, how much is that boat worth? And back then, that's what it was worth, wholesale. And I told the guy, sure, I'll sell it to you. And I went and got my kids, and I said, we can't have this one, because I got to take care of some stuff. And I wanted it. I really wanted it. And this guy gave me $25 $100 bills. I could tell he was a Texan. And I went home and paid off the rest of my amends. I was walking around telling everybody what a big deal I was, and this big hand came out of the sky with $2,500 in it and said, who? I talked to everybody I could touch that I had hurt. And then when I was about most of the way through my amends and the promises had started to be effective in my life, Don taught me how to do a 10-step. It says continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. When you see it, ask God to remove it. Talk to someone about it and make amends if you've harmed someone. And then resolutely turn your thoughts to someone you can help. The real trick there is resolutely turning your thoughts to someone you can help. You know, when I get into self today, the only way that I can save myself from all that pain and anguish and terror and all the rest of that stuff that's attendant is to find the ability to turn my thoughts to someone I can help, because it gets me out of myself. And that's the real trick in the 10th step, is being able to turn away from ourselves again when we get into it. And that's what dishonesty and resentment and fear are. They're all selfish. And I have to turn away from that. The 11th step is the toughest thing I've ever done. It's about discipline. I am undisciplined. And they told me that I had to get up in the morning and go through this whole deal, where I get up and say, God, please keep my day free from selfish, dishonest, and self-seeking motives. Please give me inspiration, intuitive thought, or decision. And I have to sit down and I have to plan my whole day. That works. That makes my day better, even if I don't do what I planned. I get through that. I pray for all the people that I want to pray for on that particular day. Ask God, please show me all through the day what my next step is to be, and please give me whatever I need to take care of the problems. And I go through this whole thing in the morning, and then it says, as I go through the day, to pause when agitated or doubtful and ask for the right thought or action. That's a trick. That's really good, if I can remember to do it. So when I get agitated or doubtful, if I can just stand back. Sometimes it helps me if I physically take a step back. And it talks about attitudes. The attitudes that I need to carry through my day are, thy will, not mine, be done. And I'm not running the show anymore. It asks me to keep those attitudes all day. And then when I go to bed at night, I need to review my day. And I need to look for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. I need to see if I put more into the day than I've taken out. I need to see if I owe amends to someone. I need to ask myself all the questions in the 11th step at night. And that is a discipline. And it works. There's a description in the book, I think it's about the guy from the auto agency. Or no, it's about the accountant, I think. And it talks about these 2 members from Alcoholics Anonymous calling on this guy. And when they walked in, he didn't like it because they were smiling. They grinned, which I didn't like so much. And then asked me if I thought myself alcoholic and if I was really licked this time. You know, I do that with people that I work with. I had to concede both propositions. They piled on me heaps of evidence to the effect that an alcoholic mentality such as I had exhibited in Washington was a hopeless condition. And they cited cases out of their own experience by the dozen. This process snuffed out the last flicker of conviction that I could do the job myself. Then they outlined the spiritual answer and program of action, which 100 of them had followed successfully. Though I had been only a nominal churchman, their proposals were not intellectually hard to swallow, but the program of action, though entirely sensible, was pretty drastic. Why do you think he'd say that? Why do you think he thought it was drastic? These guys came in and told him what the steps were about. Huh? They went in and told him about the 4-step. And they probably said something about God. They probably told him he was going to have to make amends. And this guy says, though I had been only a nominal churchman, their proposals were not intellectually hard to swallow. But the program of action, though entirely sensible, was pretty drastic. You better believe it. And if that's the way they were doing it, that's the way I want to do it. It meant I had to throw several lifelong conceptions out the window. That was not easy, but the moment I made up my mind to go through with the process, I had the curious feeling that my alcohol condition was relieved, as in fact it proved to be. That's amazing. That means God's going to relieve it if you agree to it. That's my experience, too. When I made a decision to give myself to this simple process, I didn't want to drink anymore. When someone told me what this process was about and I agreed to it, I never wanted another drink. And I am a chronic burnout alcoholic. So when I work with someone today and they come over and they say, Bob, I'd like you to be my sponsor, the first thing I do is I make them call me back 2 or 3 times to see if they're real. And then I sit down with them and I go through the steps with them. And I say, okay, here's the deal. This is what I'm going to ask you to do, and your part of this bargain is that you will do everything that's within your power to get through this process all the way. And my part of this deal is that as long as you're willing to try to get through it, I will stay with you. I will walk with you. And that's what I do. I'm the first one in my family to have ever lived this life. I have everything that I have ever wanted and more. I have a sense of peace and comfort most of the time that was completely foreign to me. I have the respect of my peers in both business and AA. If you want what I have, do what I did. Trust God, clean house, work with others. Thanks.